good morning, good evening, depending on your time zone. It is such a pleasure to be here learning with you again. This is the second part of Between Heaven and Earth, case studies of the tension between halakha and morality with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. That just means that you can choose to put your camera on if you wish, and that when Rabbi Nati invites questions or comments, you can unmute yourself and ask yourself. Questions and comments are always welcome in the chat, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, on the Facebook comments. And we just ask that you keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, so that it minimizes background noise and we can all hear each other. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Helfgot.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, good evening. I hope everyone's well. Obviously, we still are very much in the throes of this very difficult time for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel, for all those who are suffering directly and for those who are suffering indirectly. And so we certainly think about all those, and we especially the chayalim. We think about the soldiers who are involved and waiting, all family members. I'm sure many people on this Zoom have family members in Israel. Some of them may have children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces who are serving in the IDF, and so we certainly hope Mishaberach, Shui Shmor V'Inzor, and take care of all the chayalim and bring back all the hostages as soon as possible. And we hope that the zchut of our learning should keep that in mind for all of us. Okay, last week we started with an overview of the major questions of ethics and halakha. We discussed at great length. We discussed the foundational concepts in the Western philosophical tradition of the two major poles. On the one hand, the notion of divine command theory, the notion that only whatever God commands is what's valuable, what's good. There is no such thing as an ethic independent of what God commands. And therefore, the question that was posed by Euthyphro, by Euthyphro to Socrates in the dialogue of Euthyphro, do the gods do that which is holy, or is it beloved by gods because is it holy because it is holy, or is it holy because it is beloved by the gods? And here again, the question is, what exactly do we believe in the Jewish context? And it seemed to me that Tanakh is very unequivocal about that question. Tanakh, as we saw in the sources of Abraham and other places, seems to be on the side of the notion that God is certainly not capricious. God is a good God. El emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yashar, who God is a good God that can be comprehended as good by the human faculty. And the very fact that Abraham can challenge God and say, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat," will the judge of all justice not do judgment, do justice, assumes that there's some sort of bar that God lives up to by the definition that since God has taught Abraham that he is a God of justice and mercy and goodness, that God can be, so to speak, held account to some standard. And God does not respond to Abraham, "You don't understand. I'm God, I can do whatever I want, and whatever I say is ethical or is good or is moral," but rather he shows Abraham that even according to Abraham's own categories, Sodom is irredeemable, Sodom is all bad, and there's not even 10 people of righteous people in Sodom. So in the calculus of morality, he works within the categories of Abraham. So that's, and the very fact that the prophets are willing to challenge God about his justice, what we today call the problem of good and evil, the fact that Yirmiyahu and others will challenge HaKadosh Baruch Hu implies the notion that there is some sort of objective good, and that if God is supposed to be a good God, he's supposed to live up to that. On the other hand, and we saw many sources that go in that direction, including, and then we moved to Chazal, and we saw that in Chazal, there are sources that one could have potentially seen as going in the direction of claiming that no, there is no such thing as an ethical moment outside of the halakha, but rather all of God's commands are gzeirot, they're decrees, and even the attempt to find rational justification for them is inappropriate. However, we certainly saw that the dominant strain within the medieval period was certainly the notion not that way. The dominant strain was to go in the direction of no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu he gave a Torah which is rational, which makes sense, which is good. Let me just turn off my phone, which is good and which is purposeful, has reasons, and therefore God is certainly not capricious, and God is not arbitrary, and God is not, in that way. We saw again, as I said, the dominant voices in the medieval period certainly go in that direction. Maimonides and Nachmanides and many others go in that direction. I just want to finish up that even though it seems to me clear that that's the dominant thrust within the tradition, certainly in the Bible and most of Chazal, there are voices within the tradition that took a different approach. So if we look at the sources back from handout number 1, so if we can put from the handout number 1 to source 12, that's what we were up to from the handout number 1. If we could put that on the board, thank you. Thank you very much. So if you look, I don't know, this is okay. So if we go down to source number 12, towards the end of the pages, so source number 12 comes from the medieval period. Before that, right? So source number 12 is from Rav Ovadia Mibar Tanura, the commentary on Masechet Avot. So on the comment on the statement in the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, he says, I say that since this tractate is not organized around the explication of a commandment in the Torah like other tractates of the Mishnah, is rather all message of ethics and virtues, and the scholars of the nation also wrote books that they made up with the path of ethics, how a person should interact with their fellow. For that reason, the Tana opened the tractate. Moses received the Torah at Sinai to teach you that ethics and virtue in this tractate were not made up by the scholars of Mishnah, but were also said at Sinai. Now, again, this is one of those ambiguous sources. Is he coming and saying that, oh, what we know as ethics is totally only something that comes from God, and there is no objective ethical standard that God lives up to? Or no, he's just pointing out that the ethical statements that God makes also came from Sinai, but it doesn't necessarily address the question of, does God, so to speak, command the ethical because it is ethical in and of itself. The other source right after that, source number 13, it really should be 13, the Chazon Ish, the famous, he makes a very famous statement. Chovotam musariot hema lifamim guf echad im piskei halachot. So he writes, moral duties are at times synonymous with halachic rulings, and halakha determines moral right and wrong. Human beings do not decide what is robbery and injustice. Only the laws of the Torah do. Any act opposed to these laws is robbery, even if human beings agree with it, and any act within these laws is a fulfillment of justice, even contrary to human views. Again, is the Chazon Ish making a far-reaching claim that there's no such thing as ethical that God doesn't live up to any ethical moment or not. Again, it's up to discussion. The most famous voice, certainly in the modern period, a religious voice that certainly is often identified with the idea of divine command theory, the idea that God only commands, that so to speak, nothing is ethical, etc., that we don't, is Yeshaya Leibovitz. Leibovitz, if you look at this source, very famously says, if the mitzvot are in the service of God and not of man, what Leibovitz continually calls mitzvah lishma, that mitzvot have to be done lishma, for the purpose of God, they may not be directed toward the satisfaction of human wants. Any attempt to ground them in human needs, cognitive, moral, social, national, deprives them of the religious meaning. If the commandments were expressions of philosophic cognition, had a moral function, or were directed at perfection of the social order or the conservation of the people of Israel, the observant Jew would be doing service to himself, to society, to the nation. Meaning, you cannot in any way, shape, or form believe that God gives commandments, nor should one serve God out of some sense that the commandments have some sort of edifying purpose. Instead of serving God, he would be utilizing God's Torah for his own benefit as an instrument. The foregoing considerations apply equally to the ethical importance the secularists attribute to the Torah and commandments. Ethics, when regarded unconditionally as asserting its own validity, is an atheistic category par excellence. A person who is ethical in this sense regards man as the supreme end and value. That is, he deifies man. A man who perceives man as one among God's creatures and keeps in man the verse, I have always set God before me, Shiviti Hashem lenegdi, Tamid, cannot accept ethics as the overriding norm or criterion. Being moral from the standpoint of secular ethic can have only one of two meanings: directing man's will according to with man's knowledge of reality, the ethics of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Epicureans, and among the later philosophers Spinoza, or the ethics of Kant. Among the ethics of Kant, which is the idea of duty. Among the passage of Shema, we find the words, "V'lo taturu acharei levavchem ve'acharei nechem." After your own hearts is the negation of Kantian ethics. After your own eyes is the negation of Socrates. The admonition, I am the Lord your God, follows shortly afterward. The Torah does not recognize moral imperatives stemming from knowledge of natural reality or from awareness of man's duty to his fellow man. All it recognizes are mitzvot, divine imperatives. The Torah and the prophets never appeal to the human conscience, which harbors idolatrous, let's continue, idolatrous, the next page, idolatrous tendencies. No equivalent of the term conscience appears in scripture, etc., etc. Halakha as a religious institution could admit of the category of the ethical. Okay, so this is Leibovitz. She's the most extreme formulation of this. Again, and like so much of Leibovitz, it's very extreme. And again, for Leibovitz, you can only serve God if you are lishma. If you think somehow that keeping Shabbat will help ensure your family harmony, or if you keep Shabbat because it's an island of time and lets you put away your phone, all of that for him is idolatry. You're serving yourself and your social needs. You're not serving God. And therefore, for Leibovitz, there is no such thing as, oh, okay, we do it for that purpose. What Leibovitz leaves unclear here, and in other passages, again, as I think I said at the beginning last week, even for Leibovitz, the idea still would be that there does exist a realm of the ethical. It's a human realm that can come into conflict with halakha. Halakha always wins. Halakha always wins, and therefore the ethical doesn't necessarily influence the halakha. But certainly there is a thing called the ethics of human beings, and there can be conflicts, etc., that are always resolved for halakha. I'd like to now tonight begin our first case study, and our first case study starts with the Bible, and I want to address it because not only because it's in the Bible, but also because it then had a halachic ramification. And since the topic tonight is when halakha the topic of the course is when Halakha and ethics collide. I want to look at this interesting topic and how it played itself out in Jewish intellectual history, in Halakha, and then ultimately how it was then read in other terms. Okay, so if we can pop on the second source sheets. So we're going to look at the issue of Moses and the killing of the Egyptian, the famous story of Moses and the killing of the Egyptian in the narrative. Now, let's start with a passage from the Guide for the Perplexed. Rambam, in his first discussion of where Rambam very famously was very into prophecy. And in fact, Heschel, in one, Rabbi Heschel, he wrote an article in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, where he asked whether the Rambam himself believed he was a prophet. It was a very interesting article because Rambam talked so much about prophecy. Anyway, so Rambam, in the very beginning of the discussion about prophecy, he writes about how the first degree of prophecy is when God helps a person and encourages him to do good and grand, to deliver a congregation of good men from the hands of evildoers, to save a noble person, to bring happiness to a large. He finds himself in the cause that moves and urges him to this deed. The degree of divine influence is called the Spirit of the Lord, Ruach Hashem. And of the person who is under this influence, we say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, clothed him, and rested upon him. So for Rambam, when the judges, the shoftim, who constantly are being discussed, all the judges possess this degree, for the following general statement is made concerning them. The Lord raised up judges for them, and he saved them. Also, all the noble chiefs of Israel belong to this class, etc., etc. If we go down, he says, this faculty was also possessed by Moses from the time he had attained the age of manhood. It moved him to slay the Egyptian and to prevent evil from the two men that quarreled. It was so strong that after he fled Egypt out of fear and arrived in Midian, a trembling stranger, he could not restrain himself from interfering when he saw wrong being done. He could not bear it. So Rambam presents the slaying of the Egyptian as a manifestation of Moses' first stage of prophecy. So not only does Rambam have no moral qualms with what Moses does, but it is, in a sense, he was clothed with, just like the shoftim, where the Bible says explicitly, that vayal alav ruach Hashem, or some sort of phrase like that, that when Moses saved the Jew from the Egyptian, that was a manifestation of the lowest rung of prophecy, where God's Spirit comes upon a person to deliver someone from injustice. Notice, for Rambam, there is no moral qualms of what he did. If we look at the text of the Bible, if we continue, the Bible, I think the Rambam here is definitely reflective of the, so to speak, pshat of the text. If you look at the pshat of the text, it says, Vayhi bayamim ahem. It was in those days. Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe, became, after he was in the Pharaoh's court, he grew up. Vayetzei el echav. Vayar b'sivlotam. He sees their suffering. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. Vayifen cho vacho. He sees an Egyptian. Now, literal translation, makeh means hitting a Hebrew from his brothers. Vayifen cho vacho. He looked here and there. Vayar ki ein ish. Vayachat hamitzri vayitmenehu bachol. Notice carefully that if you look at the Bible had many verbs to choose from. It doesn't say, it says Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri, which sounds like like in the book of later on in the book of Exodus, the Bible, when it wants to say that someone is killing someone, it says makeh ish vamet. If you hit someone and he dies. But the Bible also says ki akeh ish et re'ehu, a person can hit another person without him dying. The word makeh is a neutral word. So when I read the verse, it sounds like the Mitzri was hitting the Ivri. He was hitting the Hebrew slave. He wasn't necessarily killing him, but the Bible makes a symmetry. Vayifen chovacho, vayar ki ein ish, vayach et hamitzri. Doesn't say vayaharog et hamitzri. It does not say, and he smote the Egyptian. Doesn't say that at all. It just says he smote the Egyptian, vayitmeneu bachol, and then he buried him. So it's interesting, the Bible does not choose to use the word for killing, which is vayaharog et hamitzri. It's almost as if, from a literary point of view, the Bible is trying to make a symmetry that what this Mitzri got was midah keneged midah. What this Mitzri received was a measure for measure of what he dealt out. But it's almost as if the Bible is trying to sidestep the moral question that can emerge is, did Moses overreact? Did Moses overreact by here killing the Mitzri as opposed to just stopping him or something along those lines? Now, you could say this is an interesting debate on a parshanut level, on the level of biblical exegesis and text. The thing is, the Talmud goes a step further, and the Talmud actually, at least some members of the Talmud, let's put it that way, some rabbis in the Talmud use this story as a halachic, so to speak, as a halachic precedent. So the Talmud, in the middle of Masechet Sanhedrin, is discussing the famous, the sugyot, the sections that discuss the status of a ben Noach. A ben Noach is a Noahide, and the status of non-Jews in that context. So the Talmud has the following statement: Amar Rabbi Chanina, Oved Kochavim, an idolater. Now again, we're not clear. Very often when the Bible puts in the word Oved Kochavim, when we in our text say Oved Kochavim, that might be for the censor. It may have been that the original text just said Nochri, a non-Jew, but they didn't want to upset when the Talmud started to be printed in the 15 and 1600s with the rise of printing. They made it, an idolater, a pagan, So it says, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Oved Kochavim Shehika Israel, if a non-Jew, but I'm translating a pagan, but probably the original text just said Nochri, Shehika Israel, who smote an Israelite, not killed an Israelite, smote an Israelite. Chayav mitah, he's obligated to be put to death. What? Shenemar, Vayifen chovacho vayar ki ein ish. Moses looked around and he saw that there was no person. Amar Rabbi Chanina, hasoter lo shel Yisrael. Even if someone slaps the face of an Israelite, ki ilu soter lo shel Shechina. It's as if you are slapping the face of the divine presence. Wow. So when you read this Talmudic statement, as it clearly seems to understand, Rabbi Chanina seems to understand that Moses certainly was justified in what he did, because later Halakha will codify that if a non-Jew smites a Jew, hits a Jew, not smites, hits a Jew, that he is liable for the death penalty. Now that raises an amazingly moral question certainly of discrimination, because in Jewish law, if a Jew smites a Jew, if a Jew hits a Jew, so they're responsible for whatever they're responsible, damages, pain, suffering, medical bills, whatever, everything that's discussed in Baba Kama, but they're certainly not liable for the death penalty. So what is going on here in this terms? So again, you could take, so to speak, an amoral approach and simply say, yeah, that's it. We accept this. We accept this distinction between Jews and non-Jews. Somehow Jews are ontologically, metaphysically different than non-Jews. And if a non-Jew hits a Jew, that they are liable for, that they're liable for the death penalty, which is just an amazing notion beyond anything. What's interesting is that the Rishonim struggle with this. So if we continue reading, the Ran, who is, of course, the Ran is Rabbeinu Nissim of Gerona, one of the great medieval commentators on the Bible. So Rabbi Nissim has the following. Notice also in his text, they had another change. Instead of saying Akum, which sounds like non-Jew, they had it a Kuthian. Kuthians were people who lived all those years ago, centuries ago, not the nice Gentiles that are printing the Talmud today in Venice and in Bromberg in the 1500s. So Kuti Shika Israel Chayav Mita. So his first interpretation is based on a fascinating understanding. But again, it's an attempt to maneuver, it's an attempt to try to find some sort of halachic paradigm that, that so to speak works within, so to speak, works within this paradigm and starts to move away from any kind of what we would call metaphysical distinction between Jews and non-Jews, and which raises all kinds of moral qualms, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you a little bit of background, in classical Jewish law, so we all know that the non-Jewish world before the Bible, right, but before the Torah is given, is commanded in the seven Noahide laws, the famous seven Noahide laws, the Zayin Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Among the seven Noahide laws is Gezel, stealing. Another thing that we know is that the rabbis make the far-reaching claim that for every one of the Noahide laws, if it's violated on purpose, that the Noahide is liable for the death penalty, which is an interesting phenomenon. They have many fewer rules. They don't have 613. They don't have 1,000, whatever, mitzvot, but they have 7. But in those 7, they're held to a very high standard according to Jewish law, if, so to speak, Jews were in charge, so to speak, if you want to use that term. So one of the 7 is Gezel, stealing. So the Ran goes down that rabbit hole. He says, Kuti shikai chayiv mita, mashma demidin gezel maitin la. So his first interpretation is that maybe it's under the category of stealing. Demali chaval begufei, mali chaval b'mono. Because what's the difference if I hurt someone on their person, or if I hurt someone in their pocketbook, in their money? And if I steal from someone, if a non-Jew steals from someone, according to the classical interpretation of the Noahide laws, that they are liable for the death penalty. So what's the difference between stealing someone's money and stealing someone's, stealing someone's dignity, and also part of their, if you hurt their arm, you cut, or you, whatever, you give them a boo-boo, or you give them a serious zetz, that's also stealing. Ulefi zeh, Lo shna kuti v'lo shna Yisrael shavim b'davar. According to this, it wouldn't matter whether the non-Jew hit a Jew or whether the non-Jew hit a non-Jew, because it's all under the rubric of Noahide law. And so it has nothing to do with some sort of ontological difference between Jews and non-Jews. It's simply within those categories, existing categories. Okay. No, go back. I'm sorry. Thank you. So that's his first approach. He says, and he says this would make sense also because at this point in history, the Jew, even though he was a Jew, he was technically a Ben Noach, because there was no such thing as Matan Torah yet. This is prior to revelation at Sinai, where the Jewish people, so to speak, become Jewish in the halachic sense of being obligated in all the mitzvot. But he says, the second approach, he says, "V'lilo mashmahachi," but it doesn't seem to me, the Dafka Yisrael, it sounds like only if the non-Jew hit the Jew. The Afal Gav the Adain lo kiblu haTorah, even though the Jews have not yet received the Torah, Kvar hayalahem mitzvot yiterot al bnei Noach. They had more mitzvot than the non-Jews. Already, they had other mitzvot. V'odim kein lama manu bichlal hazayin mitzvot shvicha damim el v'yariga. His second approach seems to go in the direction that there is some sort of ontological difference between Jews and non-Jews, or something along those lines, or not necessarily ontological in the sense of metaphysical difference, but because the Jew is more obligated in mitzvot, therefore the standard is higher. You've somehow struck someone who represents God's commandments on earth, and therefore you're held more liable. Now, again, it may not, this may be again an attempt to limit some of the moral qualms here, because the distinction is based on, so to speak, well, you've hurt someone who has more mitzvot, rather than, oh, you've hurt someone who's, so to speak, ontologically different. But it's still very, very problematic. If we go to Maimonides, we turn to Maimonides, the Rambam, the next source. So here, again, you see a certain softening of the halacha. If we go down a little bit further, thank you. Just a little, yeah, that's it. V'akum shehika Yisrael. The akum shehika Yisrael, afilu chaval bo kolshu. If a pagan hit a Jew, even if he hurt him a little bit, aval bishu chayav mita eno neherad. So Maimonides, so to speak, starts to undermine a little bit of the thing. And again, how you, and Maimonides is basically, so to speak, undermining the limud, the actual learn, Rab Chanina's statement, because Maimonides says a non-Jew who hits a Jew is liable to death, but he's not actually killed. No one would. We don't kill. We don't do that. It's almost like a hyperbolic statement. He is chayav b'misa. He's, he should be. God will take care of him or something like that. But he's certainly not killed. Now, once you do that, you've kind of broken the connection between this halacha and the source of it, because in the story of Moshe is, judge, jury, and executioner. Moshe killed the Mitzri, he killed the Egyptian. And so it's almost as if Maimonides is kind of, lessened and detached the statement from the halacha here, or whatever you want to call it, and the proof text. And in fact, a number of Rishonim are willing to go in the direction of, a number of Achronim are willing to note that for the Rambam, the pasuk about Moshe Rabbeinu is actually an asmachta. It's not really a real source. Once you go down that understanding that you are not allowed to kill the non-Jew, then you've softened the moral issue. And you've also basically said that this is more of a kind of a hyperbolic statement. And you've basically said, yeah, on some level you're obligated, and on some level God is going to take care of it, but it's not something that you can actually do. Or you go in the direction of the Torah Tamima, the source number 6. In the 20th century, the Torah Tamima will say, oh, how could, if Rambam is right, that you're not allowed to go kill the non-Jew? So he says, Masha harago Moshe ulai horaat sha'a haita. What Moses did was a one-time, a hora'at sha'ah. It was a specific one-time exception in Jewish history. It was needed at that time for whatever reason. Moses, felt that this was a galvanizing moment when the Jews needed to feel that they could be protected. Whatever it is, it's hora'at sha'ah. It can't be a model for the future. So you've, in effect, you've defanged this as a precedent. It no longer is a precedent. And again, you've lowered the moral, ethical qualm of the issue. Now, that's one way that, if we want to use again the term of hitmodedut, that's one way that the tradition, so to speak, pulled back from, so to speak, using Moses' actions as a precedent with the full force of the precedent. Number one, you go in the direction of the Rambam, where you basically say, oh, he really is not supposed to be killed. And Torah Tamima says it's an exception, it's a hora'at sha'ah. Or you go in the direction of, even if you say that he could be killed, it was only because of the laws of Noahide, laws of Gezel, and that would have applied to Jews and non-Jews. So these are all, so to speak, exegesis that lowers the temperature. When you look, there's another way to lower the temperature, and that is to, in effect, reread the story. And that goes back to what I started with, which is the Bible seems to use the term that Moses vayachet hamitzri, which is the same language that it uses by makeh, that the Mitzri was makeh, the ish ivri. Maybe the Bible is trying to tell us something else. And this is, you look source number 7. Source number 7 is the Ketav HaKabbalah. The Ketav HaKabbalah is the commentary of Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, who was a rabbi in Central Europe in the mid and late 1800s. So he writes as follows: Vayifen k'cho v'cho. Moses looked here and there. Chashav Moshe. Moses hoped or thought she'echad me'echav avrim ha'omdim svivo yitkomem al hamitzri, that one of the Jews standing around would get up and rebel against the Egyptian, v'yatzilet achav hamukeh makat mavet, and would save him from being killed, makat mavet, would save him from being killed, because he was going, if no one intervened, the beating was such that it would have killed the Jew. This is a reading which in effect argues that Moses was totally justified, that this Egyptian was a rodef, this Egyptian was a pursuer. He wasn't just hitting the Jew and Moses overreacted, but he was actually threatening the Jew with death by his beating. And so this justifies what Moses did. The source of this is actually a line in the Midrash. If we continue reading, and this is an example in source number 8 of the Midrashic read of this story is such that, number one, it introduces the idea of that this person was in danger of losing his life. Number two, it also introduces that this guy, this Mitzri, was not just some regular taskmaster, but he was a really evil dude. You start to pile on him, and the image that emerges from the Midrashic presentation is that this guy was, really, really bad and deserved it. So the rabbis said, okay, we can read it in the English, actually, so to make sure everyone gets it. So our teachers say there were taskmasters among the Egyptians and officers. One officer appointed over 10 Israelites, and the taskmasters would go to the houses of the officers at daybreak to make them go call the workers. Now here's the Midrashic reading of this story. Once an Egyptian taskmaster went to do so to an Israeli officer. Remember, there's a hierarchy. The Bible talks about how the Jews, they were taskmasters Egyptian taskmasters over the Israeli, the Jewish Hebrew taskmasters. Once an Egyptian taskmaster went to an Israeli officer, and he set his eye on his wife, who was beautiful. He called the man and brought him out of his house. Then the Egyptian returned and had relations with his wife, and she thought that he was her husband and became pregnant from him. Her husband returned and found the Egyptian leaving his house. He asked her, "Did he touch you?" She said, "Yes, but I thought he was you." When the taskmaster saw that he suspected him, he returned him to hard labor and struck him and sought to kill him. So in this midrashic story, number one, the taskmaster is a rapist. Number two, he wants to kill him. Moses saw this and looked at him and saw with Ruach HaKodesh what he did in the house, and saw what he would be done in the field, and said, surely he deserves death. As it is written, one who strikes a man shall die. And not only that, but moreover, he slept with the wife of Datan and therefore deserved killing. As it says, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely die. And that is why it's written, and he turned this way. He saw what he did to him in the home, and he did to him. So in this midrashic reading, Moses becomes the killing of the taskmaster is highly justified. It's not a moral qualm. This guy was going to kill the Jew. Number two, he was a rapist. Not only a rapist, but he was an adulterer, and therefore he should be treated as an adulterer in that sense. He took a married woman. So what you have here is, again, this is an example of where the parshanut, where the exegesis is rereading the story in such a way to tamper down and totally justify. Also, notice that this midrash introduces Ruach HaKodesh, that Moses saw this with Ruach HaKodesh, which gives it a kind of divine imprimatur, that this is not something that Moses just does on his own, but that God gave him a window into what this Egyptian had done, and therefore it was, really, really terrible, and this guy was a really horrible guy, and maybe he would rape again, and he would take another woman, and he would do this, and he was trying to kill this guy again. This is the reading here in this midrash. Now, if we continue, let's continue a little more. The next source. So I'm sorry. There is a number of other rabbinic midrashim, some early, some late, that just continue that process of justifying what Moses did in moral terms. There may be also another reason for that, but I'll get to that in a second. So, for example, there's a medieval midrash called Midrash Avkir, which is cited by the rabbis. So it's a normative midrash. I'm saying the rabbis of the Middle Ages. Vayar ki ein ish, which is a very interesting term. And Moses saw there was nobody around. The plain sense of the text is Moses looked to make sure that he wouldn't be caught. He looked here, he looked there. There's all kinds of interpretations about it. But one of them is most interesting. Vayar ki ein ish. He saw that there was no human being. So the midrash plays on that. Vayar ki ein ish. There was no ish, but there were divine beings around him. La malachim hamakifin oto, to the angels who were surrounding Moses. Sha'al imra'ui lahorgo. So he asked the shaila from the divine, the divine retinue. So again, in this reading, Moses is, asking for divine permission. So if you get a divine psak that you can kill this person, so again, you are pushing this idea that Moses was justified. More than that, Rashi cites another midrash, Vayar ki ein ish. So this midrash interprets it in a different way. Ra'ah, he saw she'ein mi she'etzei mimenu she'yitgayer. He saw that there was nobody who was going to emerge from this person and eventually convert to Judaism, meaning he saw that out of this Egyptian nothing good, quote unquote, would emerge. That Moses, this person was a bad guy who was going to give birth to bad guys. There was no possibility of redemption, etc. So you have this constant move to justify what Moses did. You have other midrashim that then also talk about how did Moses kill him, because it says Vayarki Einish Vayachet HaMitzri Vayitmenehu Bachol. Now, if you look right on the second day, Moses went out and he saw two Jews fighting, and one Jew says to the other Jew, Halehargeni ata omer, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses sees that what he did was discovered. The midrash on that phrase, Halehargeni ata omer, which is simply an idiom, which means, are you going to kill me like you did to the Egyptian? Halehargeni ata omer, is that your intention? The midrash picks up on the word omer, that Moses killed with speech, that Moses killed. And again, in one tradition, Moses killed with the Shem HaMeforash. He was able to kill the Egyptian cleanly, bloodlessly, with the divine name. Once again, if you're able to kill with the divine name, that means that you've been given divine permission in this situation to shed the blood of this person. And so you, again, are, with all of these midrashim, you're making this guy so bad that morally what Moses did is legitimate. I do also want to point out that some scholars have also noted that there may be something else, going on. There may be something else going on, and that is that Moses, the rabbis in the period, certainly the period of the Roman domination, were very, very weary of using the Moses precedent as a precedent for Jews to rebel against Rome, because it would get them into a lot of trouble. As we know, what happened with the first rebellion, which ended in the destruction of the temple, and the Bar Kokhba revolt, which ended in the destruction of Beitar and the Jewish community and Jerusalem being exiled, and Aelia Capitolina and all that stuff. So there is a trend in some scholarship which says that there was a kind of pushback within rabbinic thought against what we might call militarism or militancy. And therefore, you try to defang many of the precedents in the Bible for taking the law into your own hands against the oppressor, because of what that means in terms of the future and potentially rabble rousing and getting the Jewish community into trouble. Again, that's another strand in terms of this, but there's certainly an element here of justifying. Now, not everybody liked these approaches, and so, for example, you find Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who lived at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. He's not into this, and he simply will read it straight up. He says, Yezeh eat tzedek, it would be unjust. It would be unjust if we simply looked at it in kind of very dry legal terms. And ask the question, which clearly in the late 1800s, certainly anti-Semites and others were asking, was Moses, permitted to kill the Egyptian because he had afflicted the Jew? You don't have to go down the road of Reb Tzvi Mecklenburg, al pi midrash, following the midrash, that he wanted to kill him. He says you don't have to go. That's not the simple reading. Moses' entire goal here was to stand on the side of the Jews, of those who were oppressed. He could only have done this by killing the Egyptian. Because if you had just stopped him temporarily, he would have just increased his brutality. And in a certain sense, Moses felt that this was the moral thing to do, to stop this guy who tomorrow would probably hurt more and more people. And is it proper to look at this in a kind of dry legal way when an entire people and its rights are being, so to speak, crushed? And so for him, it's not a normal legal case. It's very much like, this was an 8 sorech, an 8 sarah, almost like the hora'at sha'ah. It was something that needed to be done that was an exception. I do want to show you in the close of tonight's shir that there were those within the tradition who were not comfortable with what Moshe did and were willing to pull back, meaning there's this kind of yin and yang and there's this tension. And especially if you are very troubled by this, there's a different direction that some sources take. So for example, if you look at source number 12, listen to this. The Bible in the beginning of Parshat Dvarim, right before Moses starts to present the laws of Mishneh Torah in Dvarim, there's a small little passage where it says that Moses set up the cities of refuge, the Arei Miklat. It's one of the only little narratives in the book of Devarim at the beginning. So the Midrash says, Ma ra'a Moshe litein nafsho al Arei Miklat. Why was Moshe so concerned and and so passionate about setting up the Arei Miklat? Amar Rab Levi, Mi she'achal et hatavshil hu yodea ta'amo. Someone who had to eat that stew really knows its taste, which is an idiom which means someone who went through it also understands it. Ketzad. What does that mean? Keshaharag Moshe tamitzri, when Moses killed the Egyptian, Yatsa b'yom hasheni umatzah ledatan, he found Datan and Aviram fighting. And they started to make fun of him. Continue. Let's go down a little bit more. Halahargeni ata omer, kevan sheshama paro kach amar, kama dvarim shamati v'shatakti. I heard a number of things that you did. Kevan shigi al shvichu damim tifsu oto. They grabbed him. In this reading, Moses running away to Midian is an act of galut. It's an act of like a rotzeach b'shogeg. In this reading, Moses is not, Moses killed someone by accident. Maybe he didn't intend to kill him, but he killed him. And he required some sort of penance to run away. You look at the next source, the Midrash Tanchuma says it even more clearly. It says, Az Yavdil Moshe, then Moses separated. Ma'u Az Yavdil Lashon Shira, Mia Marshia Harotzeach, the murderer, Shektiv Mot Yamut Harotzeach, Rotzeach Mia Marshira, Moshe Marshira. Mashal Hed Yod Omer, Misha Achalat Tavshir Yodea Matamo. Lafi Shaharaget HaMitzri Barach, because Moses killed the Egyptian and had to run away. Lekach Yodea Ma'am bin Avshol Shel Horeg. He understands what the person who is a Rotzeach B'Shogeg goes through. In this reading, Moses is considered a Rotzeach B'Shogeg, an inadvertent murderer who has to get some penance. There are midrashim that go even further in critiquing Moses for what he did. Very famously, and that's the last source we're looking at tonight. If you look at source number 13, we'll bring it up a little bit. Thank you. So if you look at source number 13, this is called the Midrash of Ptirat Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a very beautiful Midrash. Again, we don't know exactly when it's from, the late Middle Ages. And in this Midrash, which is cited by Rishonim, the Midrash speaks of the fact that when God decided to bring about the death of Moses at the end of his life, Moses starts to argue with God. And God says, look, in history, people were born and people die. Everyone's got to die. And then Moshe says, and Moses turns to God in line number 3. Amar lo ribono shalom, Master Yunus, Adam harishon ganav achal ma shelo ratzita. The primordial man stole and ate what you didn't want, and you kansalav mita. Va'ani ganavti klum lefanecha. Did I ever steal anything? Why should I die? And God responds, look, Noah never stole anything, but he also had to die. Everybody's got to die. Even Abraham's got to die. So at this point, he says, God says to him, are you greater than Abraham? Are you greater than Yitzchak? And then finally, God says, if you look at the bottom, he says, Yitzchak had children who weren't so great. He had Esav. I didn't have anything like that. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the last 3 lines. Klum amarti lecha shetarog et hamitzri? Did I ever ask you to kill the Egyptian? Amar lo Moshe, ve'ata haragta kol b'chorei Mitzrayim. You killed all the firstborn. Va'ani amut b'shvil Mitzri echad. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ve'ata domeh elai. You're like me. Ani meimitu mechayeh. I have the power of life and death. You don't have the power of life and death. You should never have, adjudicated to yourself that power of killing the Mitzri. It wasn't justified. So in this midrashic reading, Moses is not justified at all in what he did, and there is a critique. And not only can't we use what Moses did as a precedent, and not only is it that, maybe Moses did b'shogeg, Moses' actions are criticized, and he had no right to do it, and maybe it's part of why he ultimately dies, which is an amazing reading of the biblical text. And so this tonight was a small example of a moral under the surface. It's not made explicit. That's why I want to start with the less explicit and then get to the explicit. A kind of struggle here on a story in the Bible about Moshe Rabbeinu, who's certainly one of the greatest of the great. And do you ignore the moral issues entirely, which some of the Rishonim did, or do you start to, so to speak, defang a little bit of them? And you ultimately justify what Moses did because this guy was so terrible and really wanted to kill the Jew? Or do you actually read it in the quote unquote pshat sense, and then you're willing to critique Moshe? Again, this is an interesting example of the struggle of dealing with it. We're going to get into more difficult territory in the next few weeks as we get into the issues related to mamzer, issues related to aguna, issues related to Amalek, issues related to the Hanidachat, issues related to these very, very sensitive topics that we hope to examine and see how throughout the ages the struggle was played out. I want to wish everybody a good evening and hope everybody has a good week. We should hear good news here and in Israel, and Laila Tov to everybody, and Shabbat Shalom. Even though it's very early in the week, let's hope that we all have a good Shabbat this week, and I'll see you next week.
Shalom. Emphasis on shalom.
Yes.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot, and thank you everyone for joining us in our learning. A reminder that you can sign up for our many more classes happening this winter's Zman at Drisha at 5784.drisha.org, and see you next week.
See you next week.